Hard Times by Charles Dickens, Book the First, Sowing, Chapter 11, No Way Out. The fairy palaces burst into illuminations before pale morning showed the monstrous serpents of smoke trailing themselves over Coketown, a clattering of clogs upon the pavement, a rapid ringing of bells, and all the melancholy mad elephants, polished and oiled up for the day's monotony, were at their heavy exercise again. Stephen bent over his loom, quiet, watchful, and steady. A special contrast, as every man was in the forest of looms where Stephen worked, in the crashing, smashing, tearing piece of mechanism at which he labored. Never fear, good people, of an anxious turn of mind, that art will consign nature to oblivion. Set anywhere side by side the work of God and the work of man, and the former, even though he be a troop of hands of very small account, will gain in dignity from the comparison. So many hundred hands in this mill, so many hundred horse steam power. It is known to the force of a single pound weight what the engine will do, but not all the calculations of the national debt can tell me the capacity for good or evil, for love or hatred, for patriotism or discontent, for the decomposition of virtue and device, or the reverse at any single moment in the soul of one of these its quiet servants, with the composed faces and the regulated actions. There is no mystery in it. There is an unfathomable mystery in the meanest of them forever. Supposing we were to reverse our arithmetic for material objects and to govern these awful unknown quantities by other means. The day grew strong and showed itself outside, even against the flaming lights within. The lights were turned out and the work went on. The rain fell, and the smoke serpents, submissive to the curse of all that tribe, trailed themselves upon the earth in the waste yard outside. The steam from the escape pipe, the litter of barrels and old iron, the shining heaps of coals, the ashes everywhere, were shrouded in a veil of mist and rain. The work went on until the noon bell rang, more clattering upon the pavements. The looms and wheels and hands all out of gear for an hour. Stephen came out of the hot mill into the damp wind and cold wet streets, haggard and worn. He turned from his own class and his own quarter, taking nothing but a little bread as he walked along toward the hill on which his principal employer lived, in a red house with black outside shutters, green inside blinds, a black street door, up 2 white steps, Bounderby in letters very like himself, upon a brazen plate, and round brazen door handle underneath it, like a brazen full stop. Mr. Bounderby was at his lunch, so Stephen had expected. Would his servant say that one of his hands begged leave to speak to him? Message in return requiring the name of hand, Stephen Blackpool. There was nothing troublesome against Stephen Blackpool. Yes, he might come in. Stephen Blackpool in the parlor, Mr. Bounderby, whom he just knew by sight, at lunch on chop and sherry. Mrs. Sparsit, netting at the fireside, in a side saddle attitude, with one foot in a cotton stirrup. It was a part at once of Mrs. Sparsit's dignity and service not to lunch. She supervised the meal officially, but implied that in her own stately person, she considered lunch a weakness. "Now, Stephen," said Mr. Bounderby, "what's the matter with you?" Stephen made a low bow. "Not a servile one. These hands will never do that, Lord bless you. Sir, you'll never catch them at it if they have been with you 20 years, and, as a complimentary toilet for Mrs. Sparsit, tucked his neckerchief ends into his waistcoat. "Now you know," said Mr. Bounderby, taking some sherry, "we have never had any difficulty with you, and you have never been one of the unreasonable ones. You don't expect to be set up in a coach and six and be fed on turtle soup and venison with a gold spoon, as many of 'em do." Mr. Bounderby always represented this to be the sole immediate and direct object of any hand who is not entirely satisfied, and therefore I know that you have not come here to make a complaint. Now you know I am certain of that beforehand. "No, sir. Sure I had not come For naught o' that kind. Mr. Bounderby seemed agreeably surprised, notwithstanding his previous strong conviction. Very well, he returned. You're a steady hand, and I was not mistaken. Now let me hear what it's all about. As it's not that, let me hear what it is. What have you got to say? Out with it, lad. Stephen happened to glance toward Mrs. Sparsit. I can go, Mr. Bounderby, if you wish it, said that self-sacrificing lady, making a feint of taking her foot out of the stirrup. Mr. Bounderby stayed her by holding a mouthful of chop in suspension before swallowing it, and putting out his left hand, then, withdrawing his hand and swallowing his mouthful of chop, he said to Stephen, Now you know, this good lady is a born lady, a high lady. You are not to suppose because she keeps my house for me that she hasn't been very high up the tree. Up the tree at the top of the tree. Now, if you have got anything to say that can't be said before a born lady, this lady will leave the room. If what you have got to say can be said before a born lady, this lady will stay where she is. Sir, I hope I never had naught to say. Not fitting for a born lady to hear, sir, sin. I were born mysen, was the reply, accompanied with a slight flush. Very well, said Mr. Bounderby, pushing away his plate and leaning back. Fire away! I come, Stephen began, raising his eyes from the floor after a moment's consideration, to ask you your advice. I need to overmuch. I was married on Easter Monday, 19 years sin, long and dree. She was a young lass, pretty enow, with good accounts of herself. Well, she went bad soon, not along of me. God knows I were not an unkind husband to her. I have heard all this before, said Mr. Bounderby. She took to drinking, left off working, sold the furniture, pawned the clothes, and played old gooseberry. I were patient with her. The more fool you, I think, said Mr. Bounderby in confidence to his wine-glass. I were very patient with her. I tried to wean her fra to o'er than o'er again. I tried this, I tried that, I tried t'other. I had gone home many's the time, and found all vanished as I had in the world, and her without a sense left to bless herself, lying on bare ground. I had done not once, not twice, 20 times. Every line in his face deepened as he said it, and put in its after-affecting evidence of the suffering he had undergone. From bad to worse, from worse to worse, and she left me. She disgraced herself everywheres, bitter and bad. She come back, she come back, she come back. What could I do to hinder her? I had walked the streets nights long, ere ever I'd go home. I had gone to the brig, minded to fling myself over, and had no more on't. I had bore that much, that I were old when I were young. Mrs. Sparsit, easily ambling along with her netting needles, raised the Coriolanian eyebrows and shook her head, as much as to say, The great no trouble, as well as the small. Please turn your humble eye in my direction. I have paid her to keep away from me. These 5 year I have paid her. I had gotten decent futrals about me again. I had lived hard and sad, but not ashamed and fearful of the minutes of my life. Last night I went home. There she lay upon my hearthstone. There she is! In the strength of his misfortune and the energy of his distress, he fired for the moment like a proud man. In another moment he stood, as he had stood all the time, his usual stoop upon him, his pondering face addressed to Mr. Bounderby with a curious expression on it, half shrewd, half perplexed, as if his mind were set upon unraveling something very difficult. His hat held tight in his left hand, which rested on his hip, his right arm, with a rugged propriety of force of action, very earnestly emphasizing what he said, not least so when it always paused, a little bent, and not withdrawn as he paused. I was acquainted with all this, you know, said Mr. Bounderby, except the last clause, long ago. It's a bad job, that's what it is. You had better have been satisfied as you were, and not have got married. However, it's too late to say that. It was an unequal marriage, sir, in point of years. Was it an unequal marriage, sir, in point of years? Asked Mrs. Sparsit. You hear what the lady asked? Was it an unequal marriage in point of years, this unlucky job of yours? Said Mr. Bounderby. Not e'en so. I were 21 myself, she were 29, but... Indeed, sir, said Mrs. Sparsit to her chief, with great placidity. I inferred from its being so miserable a marriage that it was probably an unequal one in point of years. Mr. Bounderby looked very hard at the good lady in a sidelong way that had an odd sheepishness about it. He fortified himself with a little more sherry. Well, why don't you go on? He then asked, turning rather irritable on Stephen Blackpool. I ha' come to ask you, sir, how am I to be ridded o' this woman? Stephen infused with yet a deeper gravity into the mixed expression of his attentive face. Mrs. Sparsit uttered a gentle ejaculation, as having received a mortal shock. What do you mean? Said Bounderby, getting up to lean his back against the chimney-piece. What are you talking about? You took her for better or for worse. I mun be ridden of her. I cannot bear to no more. I ha' lived under to so long, for that I hadn't the pity and comforting words of the best lass living or dead. Haply but for her, I should have gone hottering mad. He wishes to be free to marry the female of whom he speaks, I fear, sir, observed Mrs. Sparsit in an undertone, and much dejected by the immorality of the people. I do. The lady says what's right. I do. The lady says what's right, I do. I were coming to it. I ha' read in the papers that great folk, fair far of 'em, I wishes 'em no hurt, are not bounded together for better or for worse so fast, but that they can be set free for their misfortunate marriages, and marry o'er again, when they dunna agree, for that their tempers is ill-sorted. They has rooms of one kind and another in their houses, above a bit, and they can live asunders. We folk ha' only one room, and we can't. When that won't do, they ha' goed on the cash, and they can say, this for you, and this for me, and they can go their separate ways. We can't. Spite of that, they can be set free for smaller wrongs than mine. So I mun be ridden of this woman, and I want to know how. Know how, returned Mr. Bounderby. If I do her any hurt, sir, there's a law to punish me. Of course there is. If I flee from her, there's a law to punish me. Of course there is. If I marry t'other dear lass, there's a law to punish me. Of course there is. If I was to live with her, not marry her, saying such a thing could be, which it never could or would, and her so good, there's a law to punish me, in every innocent child belonging to me. Of course there is. Now, a God's name, said Stephen Blackpool, show me the law to help me. There's a sanctity in this relation of life, said Mr. Bounderby, and it must be kept up. No, dunnot say that, sir. T'ain't kept up that way, not that way. 'Tis kept down that way. I'm a weaver. I were in factory when a child, but I ha' gotten in to see with Ian a year where I read in the papers every day, sizes every sessions. And you read too, I know it, with dismay, how the supposed impossibility of ever getting unchanged from one another at any price, on any terms, brings blood upon this land, and brings many common married folk to battle, murder, and sudden death. Let us have this right understood. Mine's a grievous case, and I want, if you will be so good, to know the law that helps me. Now I tell you what, said Mr. Bounderby, putting his hands in his pockets, there is such a law. Stephen, subsiding in his quiet manner, and never wandering his attention, gave a nod. But it's not for you at all. It costs money, a mint of money. How much might that be? Stephen calmly asked. Why, you'd have to go to Doctors' Commons with a suit, and you'd have to go to a court of common law with a suit, and you'd have to go to the House of Lords with a suit, and you'd have to get an Act of Parliament to enable you to marry again, and it would cost you, If it was a case of very plain sailing, I suppose from 1,000 to 1,500 pounds, said Mr. Bounderby. Perhaps twice the money. There's no other law. Certainly not. Why then, sir, said Stephen, turning white, motioning with that right hand of his, as he gave everything to the four winds. 'Tis a muddle. 'Tis just a muddle. Altogether, and the sooner I am dead, the better, Mrs. Sparsit, again dejected by the impiety of the people. Pooh, pooh, don't you talk nonsense, my good fellow, said Mr. Bounderby, about things you don't understand, and don't you call the institutions of your country a muddle, or you'll get yourself into a real muddle one of these fine mornings. The institutions of your country are not your piecework, and the only living thing you have got to do is to mind your piecework. You didn't take your wife for fast and for loose, but for better or worse. If she has turned out worse, why, all you have got to say is, she might have turned out better. 'Tis a muddle, said Stephen, shaking his head as he moved to the door. 'Tis a muddle. Now I'll tell you what, Mr. Bounderby resumed, as the valedictory address. With what I shall call your unhallowed opinions, you have been quite shocking this lady, who I have already told you is a born lady, and who, as I have not already told you, has had her own marriage misfortunes to the tune of tens of thousands of pounds. Tens of thousands of pounds, he repeated it with great relish. Now you have always been a steady hand hitherto, but my opinion is, and so I tell you plainly, that you are turning into the wrong road. You have been listening to some mischievous stranger or other. They're always about, and the best thing you can do is to come out of that. Now you know, here his countenance expressed marvelous acuteness, I can see as far as a grindstone as another man, as far into a grindstone as another man, farther than a good many, perhaps, because I had my nose well kept to it when I was young. I see traces of the turtle soup and venison and gold spoon in this. Yes, I do, cried Mr. Bounderby, shaking his head with obstinate cunning. By the Lord Harry, I do. With a very different shake of his head and a deep sigh, Stephen said, Thank you, sir. I wish you good day. So he left Mr. Bounderby swelling at his own portrait on the wall, as if he were going to explode himself into it, and Mrs. Sparsit, still ambling on with her foot in her stirrup, looked quite cast down by the popular vices. And that is the end of chapter 11.